Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. I hope what I have to say will be of interest. I mean, I would just pick up on the point that Mikey said about, I think for educational institutions in general, it's quite, and especially in the English-speaking world, where our student body is so mobile. Manchester University is the biggest single campus university in Britain, and we've been doing various bits of sort of carbon management. And the single biggest source of emissions, if you do the entire emissions of the University of Manchester, is student travel to come to campus, because of the international nature of our student body, especially graduate students, but not only, actually a decent number of undergraduates also coming from abroad. And then all the allied things like their parents coming to graduation ceremonies and them going home for Christmas and all of that type of stuff. It's not just a one-off journey. So it is a big issue structurally, I think, for educational institutions, but for lots of other organizations as well. So I'm going to talk about this in general. I've worked out just a bit of background on me. I've worked on climate politics and policy for 30 odd years and worked a lot on carbon markets, of which carbon offsets are one type, in and around the in the mid 2000s through to the early 2010s. And then the offsets were waning a bit, and now they're reviving. I think why they've become a dilemma again for lots of people in the ways they were 15, 20 years ago, but there was a sort of bit of a dip of interest in them in between. And I did with a colleague called and friend called Peter Newell, wrote a book called Climate Capitalism, which came out in 2010, which has a lot of those sorts of analyses of the state of play then, if anybody wants to follow that up. Although I then stupidly didn't put that in the resources, you know, so it's the obvious piece of self-promotion, but there you go. Okay, so I'm going to start a little bit with a sort of 101. Apologies if some people know some of this already, but I think it's probably useful just also just to remind ourselves when we say carbon offsetting or carbon offsets, what are we talking about? So the simplest way I think to explain it is a carbon offset is a project where, you know, organizational person A plays the same, you know, organizational person B to reduce their emissions instead of reducing those directly by A, right? So so it offsets the emissions produced by A by investing in emissions reduction elsewhere. So, for example, I would spend some money investing, probably not on my own with this example, in a project to help build a wind turbine elsewhere to offset the emissions that I might make from a flight or the entirety of my emissions from electricity and cars and whatever. I think in this, it's important to know that, you know, we can often tend to think of this about individual emissions, and lots of people might, you know, still can go, typically, for example, if you do buy a flight, one part in the process in booking.com or wherever will say, do you want to offset the emissions? There'll be 1.7 kilograms of CO2. This would cost you X euros or pounds or Danish kroner to offset. Do you want to do that? Right. So we experience it often as individuals, but actually the big buyers of carbon offsets are organizations. There's been a recent one in the UK, example of Heathrow Airport investing to offset its emissions, obviously not the emissions from all the flights that go in and out of Heathrow, just the operations on the ground of the buildings and the vehicles on the ground vehicles and so on at Heathrow itself. By doing things like buying up sheep farms in Wales and planting trees on them. I'm going to come back to that example a bit later on. But then there's an individual offset project, but then there's also a much more elaborate market that those offsets work within, right? So it's very rare that you get that simple individual transaction from A to B. I'll give you some money, you reduce my emissions for me. But there's a set of market institutions that enable that to function. The key of it, so there's a number of actors that do that sort of mediation between the person buying the ultimate credit and the person selling it. So there's the project developers themselves. They might be what I've called B in this sort of simple sketch. But they're often a different organization. So an engineering firm that builds the wind turbines, for example, that would do the project, they would carry it out, they would plan it, they would say, if we do this, then we will save X tons of carbon dioxide over this time period. And therefore this will generate a set of credits to sell to the buyers of those credits. There's also then most of the transactions then go through financial market institutions, essentially. So big banks, other financial firms will be doing sort of bulk buying and selling of credits from carbon offset projects, mediating those transactions between A and B, and also then generating the sense of a carbon price, just like a market will. Like, you don't know how much potatoes are going to cost you unless you go to a market and there are multiple sellers, and they say, and the price emerges because they're competing with each other. In the same way as one wind turbine project, one forestry project, one biomass project, all of which are claiming to reduce carbon, but they will try and they'll be trying to get the best price from it, and the market will drive those prices, will generate that sense of what the price of reducing carbon actually is. And then there's a series of organizations which are mostly either environmental NGOs. So the Worldwide Fund for Nature is a really important player in this bit of the picture, but also business groups themselves doing it, who have developed a series of certification schemes that mediate with the anxiety that many people have is this carbon offset project a scam? So if the developer is going to come along and say, well, if we build this wind turbine, otherwise all of that electricity would have been generated by coal or natural gas or some fossil fuel, it would have emitted this much CO2, therefore our project saves that much CO2. But it's actually really, really difficult to measure actually whether those emissions did go down. Of course, the alternative to the project doesn't happen, right? You did build the wind turbine, so you can't measure what the emissions were without the wind turbine, because the wind turbine was actually built. So you've got a complex set of methods for establishing the claim to reduce emissions on the behalf of this project, and then a bunch of assumptions that have to be built into that. So these organizations, these certifying organizations, have come in to say, look, we're going to validate whether your claim is rubbish or not. And so the market is made up of all these different actors that you will see, and mostly then, like, one of the implications for anybody thinking about doing carbon offsets is to think about the certification schemes and which ones you think are the most suit you most, or most credible, or whatever. And the final thing to say about carbon offset markets is there's sort of two key types, right? The biggest ones are actually what we call regulatory or compliance markets, right? So in the UK and in the EU, so the EU has the world's biggest carbon market called the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, where big companies, big installations of coal power plants or whatever are regulated to reduce their emissions. But one of the ways that they can do that is by buying and selling allowances, because some firms might find it more expensive to reduce than others. And so if a company that might find it really expensive would be able to say, okay, well, I'll buy some extra credits in, extra allowances in, and a company that finds it relatively cheap to reduce its emissions will then reduce its emissions further and sell those extra allowances it doesn't need anymore to the company that finds it more expensive. The emissions still go down, but the overall cost of doing so is cheaper. That's the logic, right? And in most of those markets, so in the EU ETS, the EU emissions trading system, and the UK emissions trading system, which is basically what happened when Brexit happened, the UK then created its own system. UK had actually been a leader in designing the EU system carbon market. But in both those systems, the companies that are regulated one of their options is to invest in offsets. They can't do it for all of their emissions, but they can do it for some of them, and count the credits that they buy in by investing in a wind turbine in Indonesia against their own obligations to reduce their emissions. Again, the logic, we'll come back to the logic in a minute, but the crude logic is it reduces the overall costs of meeting an emissions goal that we might have set. The other type of market is gets called the voluntary carbon markets, and this is more where the credit is not against some regulatory obligation. It's not because the company says, well, I've got to get my emissions down to X levels over this time period, and I'm going to buy some credits in from an offset market to meet some of that legal obligation. It's more that they're doing it for a variety of other reasons, to do with some sort of PR, reputational management, and so on, to be able to claim to be carbon neutral, or which is what companies used to talk about. Now they talk about claiming to be net zero. Roughly the same thing for our purposes, but not quite, as we'll see in a minute. And so it's, so that's their value. So then, of course, the validity of the claims, like the certification things, if they engage in a carbon offset project that turns out to be a complete scam, they can get into all sorts of trouble. In the early days of carbon markets, Coldplay, the big band Coldplay, said they were going to make their world tour carbon neutral by offsetting. And they invested in a massive project in southern India, forestry project in southern India, and they ended up with huge amounts of egg on their face, because it turned out, this was before these certification systems came into place, turned out all these trees were planted, but none of the local people who used that forest liked it. So they just cut them down and used them for fuel wood, or they dug them up because they wanted to plant crops again. And so it actually was, it blew up in Coldplay's face, and they looked really, really stupid. So that companies have a reason to want to make sure that the certification, the validity of the claims that the carbon offsets are not scams are quite robust. Nevertheless, they're not doing it because they're under some legal threat to that. And that at the individual level, for people thinking about whether they're going to offset a flight to go and study on an ELT course or at a university, that's the same thing, right? It's just assuaging our guilt and making us feel like that we're doing something valuable, even though that we know that the flying is a problem from the climate point of view. Okay, so what sorts of arguments do people use in favor of carbon offsets? And probably the simplest argument is that the climate itself doesn't care whether emissions are reduced, right? All that matters from the climate crisis point of view is, at the crudest level, is that the emissions go down, and they go down fast, and we get towards zero by the middle of the 21st century. Right? At the same time, reducing emissions for many actors is quite expensive. There are costs to it, to either for an individual business to have to invest a lot of money in retooling its manufacturing, for an organization, again, if you were going to sit there and say, for an organization like education institutions that have become very heavily reliant on global source of students to come and study with us, then actually you'd have to it would be incredibly costly for the University of Manchester to say, you know what, we're not going to take any international students anymore. It'd probably bankrupt us, actually. We've become so reliant on it. It's certainly very clear that the university senior management is not contemplating anything like that, right? But for power generation companies or steel manufacturers or cement manufacturers, can be very expensive to cut emissions. And so the logic is then that a market will find where the cheapest sources of emissions are. So, for example, in the UK, which is one of the world leaders in reducing emissions, it's reduced its emissions by about 45% since 1990. Very few countries have got anywhere near that. Then effectively what's happened with the bits of the markets is that it helped get rid of coal. Now, coal was already in decline, partly because of a political assault on the coal miners by the Thatcher government in the 1980s. But the market, the emissions trading system in the EU, which came in the sort of mid-2000s, essentially made it that, coal was the cheapest. Getting rid of coal from the electricity system was the cheapest way to cut emissions. And it essentially, over the course of a decade, it's basically meant that we now burn virtually no coal in the UK for electricity generation. And just because it was cheaper and we could switch to natural gas relatively straightforwardly. Now, of course, natural gas is really expensive, so it becomes a bit more complicated again. So that's the logic of why a market is a good thing. It helps find where the cheapest sources of emissions cuts are, and therefore reduces the overall costs to society of achieving those cuts. And then finally, specifically in terms of offsets, is that for a lot of organizations or individuals doing a carbon offset project, it's not just this abstract market idea, it's also a specific project. So you could sit there and say, the organizations can sit there and say, or the individuals, I'm doing something good in the world, right? I'm investing in this particular project. For large periods of time on the voluntary carbon markets, companies have really wanted to do forestry projects because they think that the afforestation is a good thing for other things, biodiversity, whatever. It's also looks really, really good on their sustainability annual reports, shiny documents that they can sell to shareholders, and look at all these forests we built. All of those, if you look at a sustainability annual report by a large corporation, they almost always have either a forest or a wind turbine on the front, one of the two, sometimes both. But it's, those are the iconic things they can use to tell a story about themselves, to themselves and their audiences, that they're doing something good in the world with their money, that their money is being spent to address climate change through those specific projects you invest in. And often those stories are also about developmental projects. So there's a relatively small niche, but a really sort of powerful niche, if you like, within carbon offset markets focused on wood stoves. And if you go and search on carbon offsets for wood stove projects, you'll find loads of projects trying to do that, where it's not only saying, okay, we're going to radically reduce deforestation in developing countries, we're going to reduce blindness in developing countries, because people cooking on open fires in indoor circumstances go blind, usually very young in age, and have all sorts of other ill health problems. Women in particular spend much less time searching for wood because they have to consume less wood in their cooking. And so you achieve a bunch of multiple developments in terms of gender equality, in terms of health in developing countries, and in terms of reducing deforestation and the emissions from burning. Because a wood stove versus an open fire uses somewhere in the realm of a fifth less fuel for the same amount of heat, useful heat. And so you can see these organizations then using offsets as a good way to combine climate goals with other goals. On the other hand, there's all sorts of reasons that people worry about carbon offsets and why they think they might be a bad thing. And there's essentially 5 here with 5 cartoons, or images. So one of these up on the top left is the idea that they're actual scams, right? That there's a certain amount of simple bullshit involved, which is sort of satirized in the cartoon on the top left, and there it's that a lot of the problems there are that in order to do a carbon offset project, you have to essentially generate a bunch of counterfactuals. You have to say, if I did not do the project, emissions would have been X, and because I am going to do the project, emissions will be X minus whatever. But you never didn't do the project, right? So you can't directly measure what the emissions would have been. And there are all sorts of complicated assumptions in doing that. So even with something you might think would be really obvious, like a wind turbine, then, well, maybe actually all that happens is you get more energy in the system in total, right? And you still have the coal-fired power plant burning. It doesn't displace the coal-fired power plant. You just have more electricity, right? And you would have been claiming that you would be basically reducing the amount of coal, but you don't know if that's true or not. And measuring that directly is impossible, because the overall amount of electricity going up in a given country, well, that's just part of the economic development process. So how do you disentangle the investment in the wind turbine versus all the other effects of economic development? A second version of that, which is in the bottom left, which is this report from Friends of the US Friends of the Report, Earth in about 2010, which was during the financial crisis. These markets carbon markets are run by, are organized as financial markets. And if those of us who can remember back to that particular crisis on the back of subprime mortgages and really, really overly complex financial instruments, were worried or making the argument that actually what we were seeing in carbon markets was the same thing. It's just a bubble that was nothing to do with actual substantive investment in dealing with climate change. A third one in the middle, and this is a very old cartoon from 1991, is the idea of carbon colonialism, right? So in other words, when if you're thinking of investing in a forestry project in Uganda, pick Uganda deliberately because there was a crisis or a scandal over one such project in Uganda, then on the one hand, it's this dynamic here, right? It's rich people saying, you know what, I don't actually want to reduce my emissions. I'm just going to pay somebody else to do so and blame them for being, for cutting down trees while I'm driving my massive car. or I'm going to pay them to not cut down the tree so that I can keep driving my massive car. So it's partly colonial in that sense. It's just rich people getting out of their obligations to stop their pollution. On the other hand, it's also colonial because now the person driving the massive car controls the forests in Uganda. And there's various cases, for example, of human rights abuses in carbon offset projects where people have been driven off the land. The lands become completely enclosed in order to manage the forests, to deal with the certification problem, right? You have to deal with the problem of the cold play thing, right? You've got to make sure that the trees actually don't get cut down later on. So you've got to keep people out, and people relied on that land for subsistence. So you've got all sorts of exploitative or injustices created by carbon offset projects. The fourth one, which is over on the bottom right, this is a cartoon from the New York Times in about 2008, which is this idea that all that's happening really is a sort of it's a new indulgence market. So anybody in the call with a Catholic past or remembers bits about the late medieval ages, where the Catholic Church was literally selling indulgences in order to get people quicker into heaven, and rich sinners would buy these indulgences. So it's that sense that it's not actually materially important. It's just assuaging people's guilt and making them feel that they're being virtuous without actually doing any good. And then the final one with the sort of carbon supermarket is simply the a different sort of moral objection to the idea that, well, maybe the future shouldn't be all about these complicated market exchanges and turning everything into a commodity, turning our future for sale. In the case of this book, this is actually a really, really good cartoon book about carbon markets by the cartoonist Kate Evans, which is easy enough to find online. But just a more general objection to the idea that everything must be for sale, and actually we should be dealing with climate change in rather different ways than using them to create new markets. So those are all sorts of objections, and some of you may have identify with one or more of those problems of carbon offsets if you're worrying about them. I want to switch a bit now just to say a little bit about, historically about where we are. So they were where carbon offsets came from, and how they've developed over time, partly because we're in a slightly weird, distinct moment of how carbon offsets are working at the moment. Because like I said earlier on, they were very popular and then they declined a bit and now they've come back. So you have very early experiments. Actually, I think the earliest one was like 1988 or 1989, where an American power generation company was building a new coal-fired power plant and said, you know what, we're a bit worried about our emissions. So they did a forestry project in I think it was Costa Rica at the time. So they funded a load of a forestry project that they said would compensate from the emissions from their coal-fired power plant. Those were just a lot of experiments to see that other people later built on. The big development was really in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So that was the first major treaty in the UN system that actually had emissions cuts targets in it. Rich countries had to cut their emissions by between them 5.2% by 2012. And one means that they could use to achieve that was to invest in other countries in emissions reduction projects, in carbon offset projects. And there's two mechanisms within the Kyoto Protocol. One's called the Clean Development Mechanism, which involves rich countries investing in carbon offset projects in developing countries. And one is called joint implementation, which is rich countries investing in each other's. Mostly in practice, what happened there was rich countries investing in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. The Western countries doing that. And so that's the immediate stimulus for the development of large-scale carbon offset markets. And all of the companies that become project developers and the financial traders and so on, their central operation is really around the Clean Development Mechanism, which becomes the biggest of these markets by quite some way. And so in the early 2000s, the Kyoto Protocol doesn't come into force until 2004, I think. But in the early 2000s, you start to get these CDM projects coming through. And on the back of them, the companies doing these CDM projects they think that they often think there and say, well, we're developing this project. It's going to take 2 or 3 years to get approved by the UN system. Why don't we sell the credits? But the project's already up and running. Why don't we sell the credits into this voluntary market before they become official CDM projects? So these voluntary markets are people, individuals or corporations offsetting their emissions for voluntary reasons or for reputational reasons, comes on the back of the CDM, because the company it's the sort of commercial strategies of the project developers and the banks and so on driving that. That's when, for example, you start to see airlines putting in a carbon offset thing. If you're going to buy a flight, it's about 2004-05. That's when those little buttons, when you're buying a flight from whoever to offset your emissions, start to be available. Then the next key moment is that the EU has said that the EU has this emissions trading system, which is its main policy instrument for reducing European emissions. That was established in the aftermath of 1997. And in 2004, they took a decision to enable companies regulated under the emissions trading system to invest in the CDM. So a European company like Siemens or whoever who's got obligations to reduce their own emissions could now just directly say, you know what, we're going to buy some credits in from the CDM. And that drives a massive demand expansion in the demand for CDM credits and CDM offset projects. And that, one of the reasons why, from the UN point of view, it was a spectacular success, the CDM. It expanded much bigger than they thought it would be. They thought it was going to play a minor role in the Kyoto Protocol. It actually became really central to it. The next thing, though, is you start to get all these stories like the Coldplay example I told earlier on of scandals, right? So you get these voluntary carbon markets, and people go, and then you get muckraking journalists going around saying, "Hang on a second, this doesn't, pass the sniff test." So we need to regulate that. And on the back of those scandals, the NGOs and then some of the business groups move in and develop these certification systems between about 2005-07 through to 2007-08. And there's about, by 2008, I think there's something like 30 or 40 of these different certification systems, partly reflecting that different people might want different things. So you get a particular you get 2 or 3 that are specifically, well, how to do a really good forestry project that's credible. And you get ones to do how to do really good wood stove projects, or how to do really good renewable energy projects, or something like that. So that's how you get the sort of maturing of carbon offset markets through these certification systems. And then of course, what happens is the global financial crisis, and the immediate effect of that on carbon offsets is that because most of the demand is coming from European firms who are buying up CDM credits to meet their obligations under the European emissions trading system, those European firms, their emissions start to collapse in 2009 because you have a massive global recession, the biggest since the 1930s. And as soon as their economic activity goes down, so do their emissions, so they don't need the credits anymore. So the price of those credits collapses, and people basically cease to be interested in carbon offsets because the emissions have already gone down so far that nobody needs to buy anymore. And so that, during most of the 2010s, that explains that. So basically, interest in carbon offsets from about 2011-12 onwards really wanes, and nobody's talking about them until relatively recently. And then it's really only again from about 2018 onwards that we get this revival of interest in carbon offsets, and of course a revival in the dilemmas and the worries about them. And this is driven by the logic of the Paris Agreement, which is the successor to the Kyoto Protocol in the UN system, agreed in 2015. And a reasonable number of Western countries in particular, but even some developing countries, start to develop what they call net zero pledges. And the UK is the leading one again in that, with a net zero pledge in 2019. And one of the last things Theresa May does before she leaves office, of shifting the UK's target, which was then already a relatively ambitious one compared to many countries, of reducing emissions by 80% by 2050, I think the date was, to getting it to net zero. The trouble is, the flip side is, though, is in the word On the one hand, lots of people said, well, the word zero is a good null, right? Zero is a better, 80% is 80% cuts, zero is 100% cuts. Zero is a nice number. We like the number zero. Lots of the environmentalists like the number zero. But the net bit meant that, well, okay, well, we, at the level of the overall Paris Agreement and the sort of global planning for how do we actually deal with the climate crisis adequate, can we actually avoid 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or whatever the temperature target is, it makes sense to think about the net, because we know we're actually going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. It's not going to be, we don't know enough at the global level to actually reduce emissions to absolute zero. And even if we got them to absolute zero, we probably are so far ahead in the climate crisis, we still need to start taking some carbon out of the atmosphere. The only way we need to know how to do that is with forests and peatland management and mangroves. Those are the three biological ways that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere at scale, in big way. The trouble, what's happened is that governments then had net zero, right? Logically, net zero only makes any sense at the level of the world as a whole. It's the world that needs to be net zero. You could sort of say, like a biggish country like Britain, maybe that makes sense. Okay, it's reasonable that the whole of Britain be net zero. It makes zero sense for a company like HSBC to claim to be, or Heathrow Airport to claim to be net zero. Nobody cares. Right? It's an irrelevance. Or the University of Manchester, which it does. We have a net zero target of 2038. And so, because then it's down, this idea of a net zero pledge is downloaded to the level of an individual organization like the University of Manchester or Heathrow Airport, they start thinking, well, how do we get to net zero? But they only start to care about the net bit of zero, so they become interested in offsets again. Partly it will draw their attention to some of the areas of their operations that might be difficult to get to zero. In the university, that would be mostly to do with buildings. And, if we're building new buildings, there's a lot of cement in those buildings. Concrete produces CO2 in a way that's very difficult to avoid, more or less impossible. Technically, we don't know how to do that yet. There's a lot of steel embedded in it, et cetera. But for Heathrow Airport, it's hard to imagine they could get to absolute zero. Obviously, again, ignoring all the flights. All their ground transportation could be electric. All of their electricity could be zero carbon. They could actually put a lot of solar panels on Heathrow Airport itself, like other airports have done, to generate electricity. But the idea of the net zero has said, oh, we can just pay for some of that money and go back to offsetting again. So that's why we get the revival in the interest in offsetting, driven by this net zero logic, which is quite different to the Kyoto Protocol. So in the Kyoto Protocol, it was rich countries only thinking about reducing their emissions by 5%, very modest. Only rich countries have targets. They can meet these targets in part through carbon offsetting. And most of the offsetting is therefore investing in developing countries via the CDM and a little bit in Eastern Europe through that other mechanism. And the offsets then can logically be in all sorts of projects, right? Wind turbines, biomass, forestry, etc. Because the developing countries have no targets to reduce their own emissions, and because we're only thinking about 5% cuts. And actually what you get is a political campaign in there to actually exclude forestry from the CDM, because measuring the actual emissions reductions from forestry projects is particularly hard compared to, say, a wind turbine, for hopefully obvious reasons. Whereas in the net zero, the Paris Agreement world that we're now in, all countries around the world have to cut their emissions under the Paris Agreement and have to have these things called nationally determined contributions plans. The ultimate aim is zero emissions, or as near as we can absolutely get to it, and probably in a real sense negative emissions. And so the offsets now are not as much within countries as north-south. So in the UK, we see a real expansion of offset projects within the UK, because it doesn't make as much sense to be there's no real logic for saying I'm going to go and do a project in India or Uganda now, because those countries have their own targets, and there's also no point. the types of projects become much more restricted, because there's no real point in investing in emissions reduction, because everybody's trying to reduce their emissions. And so increasingly now the logic of offsets is to only invest in taking atmosphere, using offsets to invest in taking carbon out of the atmosphere through forestry, peatland management, mangroves, and so on. And so in other words, the net bit of the net zero is what people are using the offsets for. So here's a couple of examples. This is from, I think, Open Democracy or something, the article on the left, which in the UK context is mostly in Scotland and Wales, where this type of issue is being raised, is significant amounts of land being bought up by corporations or by financial investors seeking to sell offsets to corporations who wanting to claim to be net zero, hence being called as a new net zero land grab. Heathrow has the example that I've used a couple of times, has bought up 3 or 4 large sheep farms in West Wales on exactly that sort of a logic. Part of the problem with this is the land grab problem, right? It's exactly, I'm doing this now in a slightly different order to these bullets, are the most, land use projects are the most problematic in terms of what we might call carbon colonialism, right? So if older projects might have been in developing countries, anybody from the Highlands of Scotland will tell you that that's not actually a particularly different logic to what's happened over the last 250 years in the Highland, from the Highland clearances onwards, right? Of driving people off the land for a variety of projects, and people, some of the buyers of this land are being referred to as the sort of green lairds and so on, driving people off land in novel ways and for novel reasons. There's a couple of examples of arguments there, one about Scotland, one about Wales. But at the same time, the land use projects are the most difficult to measure, right? If you're going to, in the bit where I am, which is also applies a lot in Scotland, but I live just outside on the Pennines, on the edge of the Pennines Peak District, outside Manchester, which is large peat moors. Restoring peatlands is for acre per acre is much better than afforestation in terms of the amount of carbon you can take out of the atmosphere if you do it well. But measuring the actual carbon uptake is incredibly difficult. Again, compared to, say, measuring the emissions reduced from a wind turbine that you've installed. So you're going down the problem of much greater susceptibility to the scams, to climate fraud, and you've had various new claims about dodgy projects of that ilk. And because we're excluding projects now that feel more, we're not excluding, you can still actually do a carbon offset in a wind turbine, but it doesn't make much sense to do so from a net zero point of view. But those projects are relatively straightforward to measure compared to the projects that are taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But it's governments that have encouraged us to think about that, right? So it's encouraged organisations, large organisations like the University of Manchester, or big private corporations or whatever, to develop these net zero targets, and that's had a triggering effect on making them think about carbon offsetting, which the managers doing the net zero plan at the University of Manchester are definitely thinking about carbon offsetting, whereas it only really makes sense for the University of Manchester to aim to be actually zero, not net zero. So that's a sort of bit of context in terms of like the dealing with. I think I'm just shy of 40 minutes, so I'm just nearly there. It obviously for an organisation that, like, from the conversation I had beforehand, many people are dealing with a sort of set of dilemmas about offsets. If you built into a business model where carbon is sort of structurally baked in, there are things that you can't do anything about, or that basically the only way that you could operate would be you could deal with the climate problem from an organizational point of view is by to completely change how you do business. Then that raises all these sorts of dilemmas. One approach is to simply say, and the more structural approach is to don't offset, but reorient your business away from carbon in a more profound way. And you can see various bits of industry that have done that, right? The electricity system in Britain has gone from 75% coal to 2% coal in the last 25 years. Right? So that's a reorienting of business in a more fundamental way from the high carbon. And even natural gas use actually is on the way down in the British electricity system now. But that might feel really, really difficult for many businesses to actually think about, imagine. Second approach is don't offset, but invest differently in carbon reduction, right? So you'll find people sitting there saying, my colleague Kevin Anderson actually is well known at Manchester University, will sit there and say, don't buy an offset because they're all scams and it's all bullshit, and you need to take responsibility for your own action, not just pass it on to somebody else. But invest in carbon reduction in some different way. Don't treat it as a carbon offset, just spend money on carbon reductions, and don't, if you like, compare your carbon creating activity from the to the investment in carbon reductions. And then the third one is engage with offsets, but be really, really choosy, and which involves a bit of time and effort to work out what types of offsets you both most want to spend your money on, and you think are the most credible claims. And I don't think there's a way of avoiding just sort of digging in and getting interested in how to do that. But there are some rules of thumbs, it seems to me. I would say don't spend money on wind turbines or biomass or whatever. Only spend money on things that take carbon out of the atmosphere. That's the logic now, because everybody should be getting themselves to zero. No logic to investing in via a carbon offset in doing that. Secondly, follow up how they are being certified, right? How a project is being certified by some sort of organization that you would regard as trustworthy, and that what they say when they say it's a certified project or certified carbon offset, that's a third-party certification. So what that means effectively is that, let's say the Woodland Trust, because there's an example there where the Woodland Trust is now helping arrange forestry-based carbon offsets in the UK. The projects that they would be essentially helping landowners develop forestry projects and then sell on carbon credits, that there would be an organization certifying that project does what it says it does, that is completely independent from both the landowner and from the Woodland Trust. And there's a suite of more or less obscure organizations that you probably won't have heard of that engage in this specialized accounting type. They're accounting firms, but they're really specialist ones. There's a company called SGS, which stands for Société Générale de Surveillance, which is a Swiss company. There's a couple of German companies called TÜV Süd, TÜV Nord. There's a Norwegian one called Det Norske Veritas, the Norwegian Truth. These are specialist firms that do this certification operations for carbon projects. And then the third one is probably don't think too much about the price. A cheap offset is likely to be a bad one. One of the problems people thought about forests is that they thought forests would be really cheap, especially forests in developing countries. But then they got into the coal pay problem. It was cheap to plant the trees. It was really expensive to monitor the trees and make sure they actually lasted for a long time. And then I think related to that last point, fund UK or your own country-based offsets, rather than in order to avoid the carbon colonialism problem. Although, depending on what you think about projects in West Wales or the Scottish Highlands, that may apply. Those types of dilemmas might apply even there. And there's a couple of websites there which are also guides, one UK-based guides on to helping think about some of those aspects of carbon offset, the dilemmas and the ways of minimizing that sense of a dilemma. Those are just some other resources there that I'll leave up. Thank you.